Good afternoon. I wanted to welcome everybody to the final palaver of the semester. We've had several interesting discussions, very lively discussions on a variety of topics. And so we're closing out the spring semester with a discussion with clinical professor of law, Mgbako.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Black Panther helped. I
was so excited when that happened in the room. Yeah.
So she's a clinical professor of law and director of the Walter Leitner International Human Rights Clinic at Fordham Law School in New York. And she's written a really amazing book on sex worker activism in Africa. It's the first book of its kind that is dealing with an increasingly important issue that's gaining ground, especially within activist communities. And so when I saw the book and saw that she was right up the road in New York, I was really excited about her coming and talking about her work, which has included work in different African countries and interviews with over 100 sex workers, male and female, cisgender, transgender. So some really amazing work. Okay, so could you give us a brief discussion of the book or a brief description of the book?
The book came out in 2016, and when it first came out, I had a sex worker from South Africa who was traveling with me to do book talks. And of course, she had to go back home. But I usually bring these slideshows because it was their idea to have their photographs in the book because they said oftentimes the way the world sees them is very different than the way they see themselves. And so I wanted to have them here with me and with us as we have this discussion. So the book is about the birth, the growth, the challenges, the successes of the sex workers' rights movement in Africa. How many people, when I use the term sex work, who knows what that is and what I'm talking about? Okay, so not even half. Okay, so what I mean is prostitution, which is a term that those of us in the movement don't use often. We use the term sex work, which was coined in the 1970s by an activist and sex worker named Carol Lee in the United States. And she coined that term because it more precisely captures why most people who are in the sex trade are in it. And it's because it's labor, it's work, it's about capital accumulation. So since she coined that term, sex worker activists throughout the world have embraced it with fierce political devotion because of the fact that it more accurately describes why people are engaged in the industry. So that's what we mean by sex work. There's been a movement for the rights of sex workers, the right to work, the right to be free from violence, discrimination, the right to access destigmatized healthcare since the 1970s. It started in the United States and in Europe, and since that time it's spread throughout the world. And in Africa it started in the 1990s. This is the first book to tell the story of the history and challenges of the sex workers' rights movement in Africa. And so I wanted the book to do a couple of things. I wanted it to engage long-standing feminist debates around sex work and apply it to the African situation. I also wanted to explore the link between criminalization of sex work and how that leads to massive human rights abuses against sex workers. Of course, that's true in Africa, but it's important to note that criminalization of sex work leads to abuses of sex workers all over the world. So although this is a case study about Africa, these issues and themes that we're going to talk about today are really true for wherever sex work is criminalized. I also wanted the book to deal with diverse sex workers. So oftentimes when we think about sex work, it's straight, cisgender, female sex workers, right? And even though that's the majority, tends to be the majority of people who are in sex work, it's much more diverse than that. So in the book, I write about trans sex workers, male sex workers, queer sex workers in general, migrant sex workers, and also talk about intersectional movement building. So the way in which sex workers are working in concert with queer activists, with harm reduction activists in Africa, and other human rights activists. And finally, I wanted to talk about decriminalization, which is the legal framework that sex workers push as really the only human rights-based legal framework for sex work, and discuss the ways in which sex workers are pushing back against political oppression and religious oppression. So the book tries to do a lot, and I hope that it accomplished that. But because it's the first book that deals with it, I really tried to have the map be very large. And it's also probably important to note that, as Professor Clark said, It's based on interviews with over 150 sex workers, diverse sex workers. I also interviewed lawyers, other human rights activists, but the core and the heart are the stories of sex workers themselves, and based on 7 different African countries. So West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa are all covered in the book. And also just to underscore what Professor Clark said, as we're talking and discussing, if you have questions, definitely jump in and we can engage those questions as we go along.
Well, one of the questions I had is, in looking at the images and the diversity of people that you interviewed, given the difficulty in, or some of the suspicion within a community of questions and people kind of, interviewing them, and, there's this kind of built-in suspicion, what are you doing it for? What's it going to be used for? So why was it important to get their stories, and why do you feel that they agreed to participate in the project?
Okay, so for me, the seeds of the book were planted a really long time ago when I was a student, when I was a grad student, my final year of law school, and I took a wonderful course in international women's rights. And what I loved about the course was that it centered the experiences of directly impacted communities. So for instance, if we were reading about female genital cutting one week, we would read from women who themselves had undergone female genital cutting. Activists would come in who had undergone FGC. The only week in which that was different was the week that we focused on prostitution. So that week, we didn't read from anyone who was working in the sex work industry. And at that time, I didn't even understand the concept of sex work, but it was confusing to me. I didn't understand, well, what was different about this community? Why didn't my professor think it was important that we would hear what they had to say? So it planted a seed for me that was then watered and sprouted years later when I joined the faculty at Fordham Law School and I started running the International Human Rights Clinic. And the way we work at the clinic at Fordham is that we partner with grassroots justice organizations. So one of the first projects that we worked on over 10 years ago now was in partnership with sex workers in India. And they invited us to come to India. So my students and I flew to southern India, to the Maharashtra district. And I was really blown away by the activism that I saw on the part of sex workers. So first of all, it was very diverse. It was transgender sex workers, cisgender sex workers. It was men and women. If a sex worker was arrested, they would show up en masse to the police station and ask that she be released. They started healthcare clinics because they were facing healthcare discrimination. They had after-school programs for their children. They had theater workshops where they would travel and do plays in order to reduce the stigma against their community. And so here was the community that had been silenced, right, when I was a student. Here were their voices. And so I started to think, well, what are the other voices? And that's when I learned about the global sex workers' rights movement that had started in Europe and America in the 1970s and then had spread all over the world. And because Africa is my geographic area of focus, I was, of course, curious about what was happening in Africa. And that's when we started working in partnership with sex worker activists in Kenya, in South Africa, in Botswana, and Namibia. And it was the same thing. I was blown away by what I was seeing, by the activism. And I felt this was a story that hadn't really been told and that needed to be told. But when I was deciding whether or not to write the book, before I did any research, I traveled to Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, some of the countries that I felt I would focus on in the book. And I met with the activists and I said, I've been working with a lot of you, I admire your work, but I only want to tell this story if you feel like it would be helpful to the movement. And so from the beginning, it was a communal exercise. They felt that they had ownership over the project. I wasn't coming in as a researcher to take stories away from them. In a lot of circumstances, we had already been working together. And so I got a resounding yes, that they felt that it would be helpful to the movement. And they really helped me in shaping what are the themes that we're going to explore and talk about in the movement. Another thing that I was really sensitive about, and I think was the reason so many of them decided to participate, was because the history of debates around sex work is really the history of the silencing, of people marginalizing the voices of people in the sex work community, feeling that they can speak on their behalf. And I didn't want to fall into that. So I decided, okay, I'm going to do tons of interviews. I'm going to quote liberally from these interviews, but even that felt like it wasn't enough. And so I decided to, throughout the book, have these first-person narratives that I would weave throughout the book, where it would be a couple of pages of a sex worker just speaking in his or her own voice based on an oral history I had taken from a sex worker without a kind of interruption of my analysis. And so there are 6 different parts of the book where I had these standalone first-person narratives. And I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from people who have read the book about that. So I really wanted it to feel that as an author, I was standing in solidarity with this community that I was writing about and not really trying to speak on their behalf.
Okay. So, and kind of wanting to talk about the perceptions of people who engage in sex work. Mm-hmm. And so you have lots of, communities across the world that, prostitution is illegal in most countries. And so you have people who are against prostitution and who have all types of stigmas or stereotypes about individuals who engage in sex work. And so one of those is that people do it because they have no other option, because they're forced into it, because of, lack of financial opportunities and so forth. But your book really kind of complicates these assumptions. And so one of the things I wanted to do, especially on the continent, many of these individuals are working in communities that are very conservative. So how do sex workers on the continent, those that you work with, understand kind of the relationship between choice, agency, and self-determination in their work?
Okay. Yeah, so there is this anti-prostitution narrative that the only reason why someone would be engaged in sex work, the only reason would be because she literally has no other options, right? Which is a really stigmatizing understanding of why people are in the industry. And what I found, particularly for cisgender female sex workers, is that that's not the case. They definitely have limited economic opportunities, and they express that. But that really wasn't different than other workers in Africa or throughout the world that I've worked with, right? So under the global capitalist system, where we have rising income inequality, there are very few workers in the world who have unfettered choice about what they do. Most workers are choosing among a severely restricted, limited set of options, and they're just doing the best that they can for themselves and their families at that given time. And so I felt it was the same narrative for sex workers. And they would break it down to me often like this. Many of them had been domestic workers, many of them had been waitresses, hairdressers, security guards, and they would say, this is how much Botswana pula I made per month as a hairdresser. And I had a friend who started sex work, and I realized that I could make 2.5 times more pula a month doing sex work. And I have 5 kids, I have 3 kids, or I want to go to school. And so I decided I'm going to do sex work now because sex work paid more, right? These were economically rational decisions that they were making. And I heard these stories over and over and over again. So they understood that their options were limited, and they understood that it's kind of cruel to talk about this idea of choice within these restricted economic realities. But at the same time, they were asserting their agency, right? They were saying, even though I'm making these decisions like every other worker under these limited economic opportunities, I'm still asserting the right to choose one thing over another. And so for a lot of them who had been domestic workers, for instance, they would say to me, I could not spend one more day cleaning someone's houses, taking care of someone's kids for hardly any money and not being able to feed my kids, right? Again, the idea that it's this economically rational decision. The reason why I think it's so important to accept this assertion of agency is because when we don't do that, what we've seen with sex workers is people say, well, they do this because they have no choice, and therefore they have no voice, and we can speak on their behalf. And even people who have limited economic opportunities, which are most people, can speak about the truth of their own lives, right? And so that's what they were asserting. They were asserting the ability to speak about the truth of their own lives. I think for the subset of the community where it's so restricted that it almost feels like a non-choice would be trans female sex workers. A lot of them who I interviewed would say, this was literally my only option, because they face so much economic discrimination. For a lot of them, hairdressing wasn't necessarily an option, or domestic work wasn't necessarily an option. But I think even in those situations, as we're trying to expand economic opportunities for everyone, we have to make sure that the options that people have right now, they can do so safely and with dignity.
Can you briefly describe or define cisgender and transgender?
Okay, so cisgender is when a person is born and the gender that they're assigned at birth matches with how they kind of identify their gender identity, right? That would be cisgender. For a transgender person, they have a gender that's assigned to them at birth that doesn't necessarily align with how they see themselves, right?
So the beginning of kind of this formal sex worker rights movement in Africa begins in South Africa and Kenya. And so how and why did the movement specifically start there, and kind of what was the role of informal activism and resistance in the movement?
Okay. So it started in Kenya and in South Africa in the 1990s, and by formal organizing, I mean the kind of NGOs that were started by sex workers to push back against abuses tied to the criminalization of sex work. In Kenya, it started in 1998. Are there any Kenyans here? Anyone of Kenyan descent? No? South African? No? Okay. One. Okay, great. Kenya and South Africa play a huge role in the book. They're probably the strongest movements in the book, which is not surprising because a lot of sex worker activists had also been anti-apartheid activists. And in Kenya, there's strong civil society, a strong history of kind of fiercely pushing back against colonialism. So it wasn't surprising to me that those were the two countries where the movement is strongest. But in Kenya, in 1998, a group of sex workers working in the Kasarani neighborhood of Nairobi were facing severe abuses from police officers, from clients, facing lack of access to justice. And so what they started doing was handing out condoms to sex workers in the Kasarani neighborhood. But what they found when they would be handing out condoms is that sex workers would thank them for the condoms, but would be talking about all of these other issues. Police abuse, healthcare discrimination, lack of labor protections. And they realized, well, this is a broader human rights issue. It was the same way in South Africa. One of the first formal groups was called Sweat. And they started also handing out condoms. And every time they would hand out condoms, sex workers would say, police every day demand that I give them blowjobs or they'll arrest me. They confiscate my condoms to use as evidence of prostitution. When I go to try and get condoms from the healthcare center, they stigmatize me. They out me as a sex worker to other people. And so in South Africa, they realized it's a broader human rights issue, and we have to have a human rights framework. So that's how it started in both of those countries. And in Kenya, where it's an incredibly grassroots movement, what they started doing was a group of leaders in the Kenyan movement literally traveled throughout the country, going to different towns, meeting with people engaged in sex work in those towns, and starting conversations. And from those conversations and from that grassroots organizing, a lot of local sex worker rights organizations were formed. So in Kenya now, there's over 70 local sex worker rights groups that exist in Kenya. It's a really, really strong movement. So I actually begin the book at a protest against abuses of sex workers in Nairobi that happens every year, where they literally take over the streets of Nairobi and get tons of media attention. And it's fantastic. And I couldn't imagine something like that happening here. Sex workers literally taking over the streets of Washington, D.C., and they would go to police stations and they would go to parliament and protesting. And you don't see that sort of activism here. So it's really strong. In terms of the informal organizing, the reason that I wanted to focus on that was because when we think about movement building, it's not just about kind of formalized NGOs, right? There's a lot of ways in which people who are marginalized resist criminalization, even outside of formalized NGOs. And that happened and happens in sex work as well. So in South Africa, when they were trying to find leaders of the movement, they were reaching out to sex workers who outside of these NGOs were informally organizing, right? So they would have money lending schemes where every month they would pool money together and then give it to a sex worker in the community who needed it that month. Or they would have ways of trying to push back against violence from clients. So they would take down license plate numbers. They would share information about clients who had previously been violent, right? That sort of informal organizing, taking each other to healthcare clinics where there was less discrimination, right? And taking sick sex workers to those healthcare centers. And so that's where they got the leaders of the South African movement. So the reason I stress it in the book is because that's when the movement starts, even before the kind of formalization of NGOs. It starts when people come together who are marginalized to push back against the harms of the carceral state.
Okay. So one of the things you also note in the book is that African feminism has not really engaged much with sex worker activism, but that there were feminists that played an essential role in kind of starting and really kind of working with the sex worker movement, specifically in Uganda, you discussed. And so could you expand on some of the intersectional movement building between African feminists and sex workers?
Yeah. So the debate about sex work, whether or not the exchange of sexual services for payment is inherently violent, like where we locate the violence, has been a kind of obsession among feminists and feminist scholars in the global north. It really hasn't been something that's been debated among African feminists, even though sex work has to do with issues of the devaluation of gendered labor, the feminization of HIV/AIDS, a lot of issues that African feminists are interested in. This is just something that they haven't engaged in. But in my research, I found, when I was looking at the kind of the story of the origins of the movement in different parts of the continent, it was really inspiring to see the role that African feminists played in East Africa, particularly in Uganda, like you said. So, of course, there's a long history of the women's rights movement in Uganda. And there was a group of Ugandan feminists who decided this narrative of good women versus bad women is really just a way of controlling all women. And they wanted a more kind of inclusive, intersectional idea of feminism. And so they started inviting sex workers and queer women to be part of the feminist forum within Uganda. And they actually got a lot of pushback from a lot of other feminists who were saying, you know, a feminism that accepts lesbians and prostitutes is not a feminism that I want to be a part of. So they were still inviting sex workers and queer women into these spaces, but they also realized that it was important for them to have a separate, safe space to kind of build their capacity as human rights leaders. And so you had these feminists in Uganda who were doing just that, setting up workshops for sex workers to come together and teaching them about human rights advocacy skills. So they tried to do it in 2008 in Kampala, and it was actually shut down by the government when the government found out about it, and they moved it to Mombasa in Kenya. And they had something called the African Women's Leadership Institute, where they invited sex workers from Uganda, from Tanzania, from Kenya, and they were basically doing trainings. And so a lot of those sex workers who were part of that institute went back to their home countries and became leaders of the sex workers' rights movement in their own countries. And that definitely happened in Uganda. So I love this story because even though in Uganda, you know, the feminist movement and the sex worker movement, it's not as strong, the ties aren't as strong as they used to be. This origin story, you would never find that origin story, for instance, here in the United States, right, where the sex worker movement has existed since the 1970s, but one of the biggest pushbacks against the sex workers' rights movement in the United States have been anti-prostitution feminists who have caused a lot of damage. And here was an example of African feminists who were being inclusive and who were part of the birth of the movement.
On harms that queer sex workers, migrant sex workers, and HIV-positive sex workers face. And then throughout the book, there's a very strong focus on transgender female sex workers. Why is it important to focus on this issue of intersectionality in the book?
Okay. So intersectionality, the concept of intersectionality is one of the many gifts that we've been given by Black feminist theorists. And for me, personally, it's such a helpful way of helping me kind of decide which political spaces I want to engage in, right? Because I'm interested in engaging in spaces that are interested in the liberation of all people. So if I'm in a space that is about anti-racism and working against white supremacy, but also isn't a feminist space, also isn't interested in queer issues, economic injustice, it's usually not a space that I'm going to engage in, right? Because then it's not interested in the liberation of all people. It's not interested in the liberation of Black women, right? If it's not a feminist space, it's not interested in the liberation of Black queer people. If it's not interested in queer issues, and it's the flip side from when where I'm in feminist spaces. If it's a transphobic feminist space, I'm not going to engage in it, right? Because they're not interested in the liberation of all women, which includes trans women. So there's within the sex worker movement there's such a sensitivity to this issue of inclusivity and intersectionality, I think because their voices have been so marginalized. So one thing when I started doing the research that wasn't surprising, but became more and more evident as I was doing it and working with sex worker communities it's a very queer space, right? There's a disproportionate representation of queer people within the sex work community. And that's for a lot of reasons. It's because of severe economic marginalization against queer folk, for instance. But so I knew if I was going to write a book about sex workers and their fight for liberation, and it's going to include all sex workers, then I have to have an intersectional approach, right? Because queer sex workers are facing abuses not only because of the criminalization of sex work, but also because of the criminalization of homosexuality, right? I have to write about the fact that in 38 African countries, homosexuality is illegal. And so when a trans woman who's a sex worker would tell me her stories of abuse, it was this mix that had to do with the criminalization of sex work, but also stigma and criminalization around her identity as a trans woman. So it's very specific abuses. It would be police officers, security forces stopping them on the street and stripping them naked in the middle of the street as a way of to say, this isn't really a woman. Look, this isn't really a woman. So the violence against her was about sex work, but it was also about her status as a trans woman. And so having that approach throughout the book, whether it was about migrant women, HIV positive sex workers, was important so that I was really telling the whole story of what was happening within the sex work community.
Okay. So you mentioned the reactions by the police to transgender sex workers. What overall, in terms of religious and political leaders? So you also mentioned that, in pretty much all of Africa, prostitution is illegal. Homosexuality is illegal in most African countries. So what have been the reactions by religious and political leaders to sex work and sex workers in Africa?
So it's actually a very similar narrative to the narrative that some political leaders and religious leaders have about the queer community. So it's this idea that people who are engaged in sex work and queer people are un-African, that they come from, that the whole idea comes from the outside, that it's kind of a Western imposition, which is really interesting because it's actually anti-homosexuality laws that come from outside, right? So if you look at African customary law, it's not concerned with this idea of criminalizing same-sex sexual activity. It's not concerned with the idea of prostitution. Those laws come from colonial penal codes. So, but you see a lot of that same narrative, this idea of sex workers and queer African people as being kind of gender outlaws, going against the gender mainstream, right? And so when I would interview people, they would have these stories about going to church on Sunday and the religious leaders who would talk about the country's going to hell because of gay people and because of prostitutes. It would be this very similar narrative that they were using for both groups, that they're a kind of threat to our cultural sovereignty. And for certain African politicians who are engaged in that sort of rhetoric around the queer African community, and there's been a lot of focus on that, in the past few years about these like crackdowns by certain African politicians against the queer community. But I did research kind of looking at what they were saying about the queer community and what those same politicians were saying about sex work. And it was very similar narratives. They're un-African, they're against African cultural sovereignty. And so in gender and sexuality studies, when we see politicians doing that around the LGBT community, we call it political homophobia. It's like using the LGBT community as scapegoats, right? To kind of have people look away from their own political failings. And it's a really similar narrative that they use against sex work. So, the gender is the thing that I think brings those two things together. This idea of these two groups as kind of acting outside of these prescribed gender norms, right? And of course, that's not what these communities feel like they're doing. For sex workers, it's not an expression of gender dissidence. For them, it's just work. I'm just trying to take care of myself and my family in the same way that for queer people, it's about loving who they love and being who they are.
So I mentioned earlier that this was the first book of its kind. So within the field, so I know you're a professor of law, but within the field of law, but also specifically within the field of African studies, what has been the reaction? Have you gotten any feedback? Has there been kind of resistance to this type of research?
No, not from scholars. This is actually the first time I've been invited by a Department of African Studies to talk about this, which I love, and that's why I was so excited to come, and also because it's Howard. But the other places, it's been mostly gender studies departments. So I've been looking to see where the book is assigned, and it's mostly in gender studies departments. So there's a long history of sex work studies. There's really a canon of sex work studies. So there have been a lot of scholars who have reached out to me and have been excited and have assigned it to their classes because it's the first book that looks at the African focus. Yeah.
Now, could you discuss the call for the decriminalization of sex work, specifically in South Africa, where there is this campaign to decriminalize sex work?
Yes. So the global sex workers' rights movement. So first, to just step back for a second. Oftentimes when people think about prostitution and sex work, what they're obsessed with is this question of, is the exchange of sexual services for money violence? Is that in and of itself violence and objectification of women? In the sex work industry, in the lives of the people who are actually in this industry, nobody's talking about that, right? What they're talking about and what they're concerned about is the link between criminalization, the fact that sex work itself is criminalized, that sex workers are criminalized, that their clients are criminalized, and how that leads to human rights abuses. And it does so in many different ways. So when people are first being introduced to this topic, and I think, well, what's the one thing that I want them to leave with? This would be it, is to really think about the harms of the carceral state against this community that manifests itself in terms of police abuse, lack of access to justice, healthcare discrimination, and lack of labor protection. So police abuse. Any sex work communities that you interview in Africa or anywhere in the world, the main thing that they'll be talking about are abuses from police officers who physically assault them, sexually assault them, verbally assault them, demand sexual favors in lieu of arrest, confiscate their condoms to use as evidence of prostitution, demand bribes, illegally detain them. It's common. It didn't matter if I was interviewing a sex worker in Mauritius, Kenya, Nigeria, sex workers in New York, sex workers in India. It's the same thing. They're low-hanging fruit. The cops see them as a criminalized population, and so they think they can get away with it, and they do get away with it. Another thing that's linked to criminalization, which would be lack of access to justice. So when sex workers are the victims of crime, and they try and go and report it to police, oftentimes the police don't want to do anything, right? They say, well, you're a prostitute, you can't be raped. What are you doing here? And so I interviewed tons of sex workers who would say, if they were robbed by a client, if they were raped by a client, they wouldn't even think to go to the police because they knew the police weren't going to do anything. And so that sends a message to the community. The message to the community is that these people don't matter and you can take advantage of them because we're really not going to do anything. Healthcare discrimination. Going to healthcare centers, trying to get access to condoms, trying to get access to testing, and being shamed by nurses, being shamed by doctors, having their sex work status outed, having their STI status outed to other people in the healthcare center, and then lack of labor protections. So if you have people working in informal economies that are criminalized, those workers don't have access to occupational health and safety standards, overtime pay, sexual harassment laws, right? So that's the violence. Mm-hmm. So feminists, particularly feminists in the global north, have been obsessed with what does it mean for a woman to engage in sexual services for money, and that's violence, and that's violence. And it's like we have to listen to sex workers who are saying, no, that's not the violence. The violence are the police who are beating me up and the healthcare workers who are discriminating against me. So that's the one thing I would want people to leave understanding, that we have to change the conversation to one about rights and justice, and asking the question of how can people, no matter what you feel, what your emotions are about the commercialization of sexual services, how can people within the sex work industry have more power over their labor? That should be the question, and not kind of how we feel and our emotions about these things. And so that's tied to the call for decriminalization, because sex workers rightly locate the violence at criminalization and stigma. The legal framework that they push for is decriminalization, the removal of criminal laws from sex work, and instead the idea of bringing it under labor and employment law, right? And so in South Africa, there's been a movement for a really long time that's been just really inspiring, where they've been doing a lot of lobbying within parliament. And it's probably started in 2010, where groups of sex workers were trained by folks from New Zealand, where sex work was decriminalized in 2003, and go to parliament in South Africa and tell their stories about what decriminalization has meant in terms of human rights abuses and stigma. And they've got a lot of allies through that. But that happens all the time. And the reason that happens is because anti-prostitution activists, particularly anti-prostitution activists within the global north, have purposefully conflated the idea of sex work and trafficking in order to push an anti-prostitution agenda. And this has been really harmful for migrant sex workers, right? I interviewed a lot of migrant sex workers for the book. And one of the things that they're always struggling with is they're not the victims of trafficking, but people assume because they're migrant sex workers that they are the victims of trafficking. And they're two different sets of issues. When we think about trafficking, people being moved into forced labor through threats, through force, through coercion, that's different than people who cross a border to be engaged in sex work. And if you're concerned with trafficking, you really need to be concerned with this issue of immigration and having borders be more open. Because one of the reasons that people are so susceptible to trafficking is because of these closed borders. And as long as you have people fleeing poverty, and it's really hard for people to cross borders, people are going to be vulnerable to trafficking. Right? So if you're concerned with trafficking, you have to be concerned with those issues of borders. But those aren't necessarily the issues that migrant sex workers are dealing with, right? For those who didn't have status within the country, part of the problem, and I didn't do, the interviews didn't really focus on what's happening with their children, so I can't speak directly to that, but in terms of what's happening with them, it was really a problem of lack of access to justice because of this double identity as sex workers, again, intersectionality as sex workers and migrants who don't have any status. So if they would have an experience with a criminal posing as a client, right, who raped them, stole from them, they would say, you're not going to go to the police, one, because you're a sex worker, and also because you're an undocumented migrant. Those are two reasons that you're not going to go. So it's overlapping reasons that they wouldn't have access to justice. But we often are not talking about issues like that because of the conflation of migrant sex workers and trafficking and sex workers in general and trafficking. So it's been so damaging. And just another point on the conflation, because something is actually going on right here in the United States about that right now, is legislation was just signed into law called SESTA, which is Stop Exploitation of Sex Trafficking Online. It's this idea that if you have an online service and third parties are using it for trafficking purposes, that the online service could then be found liable for that, right? So this was just signed into law, and this is going to be devastating to sex work communities, because sex work communities in the United States use these online platforms as a safety mechanism, right? It's much more safe to do sex work online, where you can screen clients, where you can exchange information about dangerous clients and other safety information, than to work on the streets. So when you take away that avenue, you're really making lives more difficult and more violent for sex workers. So that's happening right now here in the United States. And if you're concerned with trafficking, these online sources, there are some instances where folks are using it to facilitate trafficking, but that's actually been really helpful to law enforcement in terms of identifying victims of trafficking. So the idea that they would want to take that away as an investigative tool doesn't make any sense. In terms of what you were talking about, the carceral state, it's so interesting to me, because I've done research not only in Africa, but also with sex workers in the United States, and also sex workers in India. And many times the sex workers who I would be interviewing had never left those countries. So the sex workers in Mauritius had never left Mauritius. But they would be telling the exact same story that sex workers would be telling in New York about their condoms being confiscated by police, using them as evidence of prostitution. So all of that points to the structure, right? The laws and policies in these countries that lead to these abuses. That's why I said earlier, even though the book is about Africa, it's really about sex work throughout the world. It's about a global issue, and it's about criminalization. And we're in an interesting moment in the United States now, where we're having this conversation about the overreach of the carceral state and how it's destroyed communities that are already facing marginalization. And so we see this equally within the sex work context.
Right. I had a question. So in looking at the conditions under which sex workers find themselves on the continent versus here, so here it's often women who find themselves working for or reporting to a man, usually, who has, control over several women that, engage in sex work, bring their money back to him. And we talked briefly before this, and I was telling you about my sister who does work activism in Tanzania and has done some work with sex workers there, and said that the structure is different. There isn't this, kind of man, aka pimp, who has control over these women, that oftentimes the women pay a portion of their money, their earnings, to the police. So there isn't like this one man who controls several different women. Is that a structure? What structures are you finding, in the research that you've done in the countries you've been in terms of kind of how that system operates?
So there's a lot of different structures. But it's interesting because in the U.S. there is that narrative that most people who are working in sex work have these kind of third-party managers. But pimps is a word, it's tough for me to use because it's been so racialized in the United States. It can be problematic. But particularly with online sex work, which is how most sex workers get clients, it kind of liberated a lot of sex workers from having to use third-party managers. And even when you think about youth in sex work, right, street-based youth in the sex trade, there's this image of it's these young, disproportionately white girls from the suburbs who have these pimps that they're working with. And we know that with youth who are in the sex trade, that very few of them have these third-party managers. That the vast majority of them are working in these youth kind of networks. You know, they're disproportionately LGBTQ, disproportionately of color. A lot of them have been kicked out of their homes because of their HIV status, so they're street-based. And they're generally engaged in it in order to get access to food, in order to get access to shelter. So it's a very different narrative than the mainstream narrative that's often pushed in the United States. And so I always tell people, if you're concerned about youth in the sex trade, which you should be, we don't want young people having to trade sex to adults for food and for shelter. There are a lot of groups that work with youth in the sex trade, and we know what they need. They tell us what they need. They need access to shelters. They need access to job training, right? And if you live in a city that doesn't have enough shelter beds for LGBTQ youth, you're gonna have those youth on the streets who are trading sex for a place to sleep, right? So if that's your concern, it's like you have to kind of get out of the narrative about like the pimps and their control, and understand how it's actually working to solve the issue. In Africa, it comes in lots of different forms. There are some people who have third-party managers. I did a lot of interviews in brothels. I did a lot of interviews in massage parlors that are basically brothels, street-based interviews where there weren't a lot of third-party managers there, but there were some that I saw. But a lot of them would be working independently, or they'd work at a hotel where they like pay a certain amount to the hotel to use a room, and the hotel would know that they're using it for sex work, or they'd be working at truck stops. Where truckers would come, and that's where they would get their clients, or women who worked at bars, and they would have to pay the bar a certain amount of money, and that's where they would get their clients. So women who worked out of their homes, there are a lot of sex workers like that. So it's a mixed bag.
Okay.
My research didn't focus on that, but I did hear similar stories like that in some places where people would talk about brothels where there were women from China. There are women from Africa who are in fact trafficked. So there would, even though there is this unfortunate conflation of trafficking and sex work, that doesn't mean that trafficking into prostitution doesn't exist. It does. And for instance, in Nigeria, there were stories of women who went to Europe to do sex work, and they would send money back to help their families. And there were other stories I heard of women who thought they were going to places to do other work, and they would get there and realize that I'm supposed to be working in a brothel. In South Africa, that came up as well. And this is why it's important that we work with sex work communities, because the sex work communities know who's trafficked. They know the brothels where that's happening. And if it's criminalized, they're not going to help you figure out which of those brothels they are. In terms of the global movement, so it started in the 1970s. In 1975, a group of French sex workers took over a church in Lyon, France, and they were protesting against police fines and police abuse. And so that, in the sex worker movement, that's considered like the kind of parting shot, the start of the sex workers' rights movement. But in 1973, Coyote was formed in the United States, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics, right here in the US. So in the 1970s, it was Europe, it was the United States. In the 1980s, it started to spread to the global south. So we saw it in Ecuador, for instance. And by the 1990s, you started to see a sex worker movement in India, Africa, like I mentioned, South Africa, Kenya, and Mali. It also started in the 1990s. So that's when you saw it really kind of spread. In the beginning of the movement, it was often dominated by women from the global north. That started to change in the 1990s for, I think, a couple of reasons. One, there was a lot more HIV/AIDS funding, so now sex workers from the global south had access to these international forums through HIV/AIDS funding to talk about sex work. You started seeing the rise of really strong, prominent sex worker groups from the global south, like Sweat in South Africa, and other groups that I was talking about, like in Kenya, and then really strong groups in India that started in the 1990s. And you also have the start of the what's called NSWP, the Global Network of Sex Work Projects. that is very much about inclusivity and ensuring that the movement reflects its diversity. So you started to see a change, and now I would argue that the folks who are at the vanguard of the movement are sex workers from the Global South. That's another reason I really wanted to write the book, because one of the narratives by anti-prostitution activists is we don't have to listen to the claims of sex worker rights activists because they're all white, Western women, privileged from the global North, and they're non-representative, right? Whereas in the movement, it's really considered at this point the sex workers in India, in Africa, who are really kind of at the forefront of the movement right now. So one of the biggest global gatherings of sex workers' rights activists was at the Sex Worker Freedom Festival in India, and sex workers came from all over the world, right? So we've seen that change. We've also seen really interesting South-South collaboration. So African sex workers going to India and learning different methods of advocacy. They started what's called the Sex Worker Academy of Africa, and Indian sex workers coming to Africa to help train them, right? Had nothing to do with sex workers from the West, just this South-South collaboration. So I wanted to push back against anti-prostitution feminists who are cynically using this race and class analysis by saying these are only white Western women to actually silence the voices of sex workers of color from the Global South who are like, no, we are here. Right? And we're taking over the streets of Nairobi and we're doing lobbying in parliament in South Africa. Don't say that we're not here. We are here. Yeah. And because of the intersectional approach we talked about, I really wanted to make sure that my interviews reflected the demographics that I was coming across. And those included women and men who were in sex work. And in places like Kenya, for instance, there are a lot of men who are like the leaders of the sex worker movement in Kenya, in South Africa as well. One challenge that they shared with me in terms of organizing was because sex work is seen as kind of gendered labor, as something that women do, even though men do it too, it was oftentimes in the beginning hard to reach men because they didn't necessarily want to identify as sex workers. And so in South Africa, what they did to get more men who were in fact engaged in sex work to be involved is to say, okay, you don't necessarily have to identify yourself as a sex worker, but you have kind of helping them understand and see it as labor, right? And like, if you don't identify, that's fine. You can still come and be part of this group and talk about these issues. And once they started doing that, they started getting a lot of men coming in and talking about these issues. In terms of queer male sex workers, a lot of the issues that they faced in terms of violence from police officers had to do both with their status as sex workers, but also their status as queer men. So when they would talk about violence that they experienced from police, it was this kind of homophobic violence, but it was also this horophobic kind of violence as well. And so those were things that came up a lot. In the Gambia, it's interesting because in Africa, there's a lot of transactional sex that goes on, right? And so I write a little bit about it in Nigeria. I want to be careful not to always conflate the two because oftentimes they're dealing with different issues. So you can be part of a transactional sexual relationship with, let's say, you're a young woman in a university and you have an older man who you sleep with regularly, and he doesn't give you money, but he maybe pays your school fees, he buys you clothes, he buys you handbags. That's not considered illegal, right? If he's not necessarily giving you money. It's not necessarily considered illegal, but those women might be, and oftentimes are more vulnerable, for instance, to HIV because of the power differential within those relationships. So that's the only part of the book where I write about transactional sex, and there was this really interesting conversation in Nigeria where the sex worker activists were trying to think of, do we reach out to these people who do not see themselves as sex workers, right? They're like, I'm not a sex worker. I'm in university and I have this relationship with this person and he pays my school fees, And that's a conversation they're still thinking about and they're a part of. So it is important that we don't necessarily conflate those two things, right? So there's a lot of that happens in the Gambia. There's a lot of that happens in Senegal. I lived in Senegal for a year, where you would see these young men and older women from outside, and there's obviously a sexual relationship. In exchange for that, they buy them things. Maybe they'll take them to Europe. Maybe they'll, and that's not necessarily always illegal. And so just in the literature, we kind of differentiate those two things, I think, for important reasons, because their vulnerability has different structural reasons, right? With sex work, it has a lot to do with criminalization and what that means. With transactional sex, it is about this power differential that we often see.
I just wanted to say real quick that in Tanzania, one of the things that's become popular is Maasai men. And so you have areas in downtown Dar es Salaam where women from outside will go and basically, get a Maasai man. And, the idea. So you also now have men who are not Maasai who will dress up as Maasai.
As if they're Maasai.
And go and, engage.
They're like, sure, I'll be Maasai for you. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think it's really important that we define and see the violence where the people who are experiencing it see the violence. And that's where there's been such a huge disconnect in terms of sex work. And luckily that's changing now with the mainstreaming of the idea of sex workers' rights as human rights. And we're seeing a lot of mainstream influential human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, who have all come out in favor of decriminalization and have located the violence where sex workers themselves experience the violence, right? And that's because of criminalization and what that means in their lives. Criminalization on the national level, on the local level. In terms of the clientele is more international when you're in kind of seaside cities. So in a place like Mombasa, for instance, most of my studies were not in those locales, but I think the majority of clients for African sex workers are African people, right, within those local communities, or people who are truck drivers, who are mobile populations coming from other communities. And the way in which sex workers talked about violence, no matter where I was, and clients, and there's a lot of violence from clients, but they talked about it in a very specific way. If they meet a client and they decide this is the service, this is how much I'll be paid for it, and that service is given, and they're paid by the client, I never interviewed a sex worker who says that that is violence, right? Because for them, it is an economic reason that they're a part of it. They see it as work. And so if that happens for them, that's work. That's what they want to happen. They want more money in their pocket, right? For them, the violence is when they say, this is what's going to happen. And then the client pushes it and more than that happens and you have a sexual assault that occurs, right? Or they agree to a payment and the sexual service is given, and this story came up a lot, and the client wouldn't pay them, or the client would beat them, or the client would drive them somewhere and drop them off. That for them was violence. And I think it's really important that we distinguish between the two, because if we conflate those two things, then you get to the point where you say, well, a prostitute can't be raped because it's all rape, right? If they agree on the service, they agree on the payment, and that's what happens, and the client says, for me, that was a day's work, and someone from the outside says, that was violence, when she actually experiences violence and goes to the police don't see it as violence because we've conflated the two things. So my research in terms of the narrative of where violence is located in relationship to clients is where sex workers locate it, right? And it's totally tied to criminalization. And over again, whether it's in Africa or it's here, we've had, I'm thinking in the United States in Seattle, there was a really famous serial killer in Seattle who killed, it was going to be called the Green River serial killer, something like that, Gary Ridgway. And he killed a lot of sex workers. And when he was interviewed about why he did it, he said, well, I knew I could get away with it because I knew no one would do anything because these are throwaway people, right? And so that's how the lack of access to justice is directly linked to violence. So I didn't even really see those people as clients. They were really criminals who were pretending to be clients and taking advantage of the fact that it's a criminalized system. And so the workers really don't have any rights, and they knew that they could get away with it because of criminalization. Because the sex worker is not going to go to the police, and if she goes to the police, nothing's going to happen. And so these people who are not clients, but who are criminals posing as clients, know that they can get away with it. So the FGC conversation is such a complicated discussion, and I've done work on FGC in Sierra Leone, and as I'm sure you know, for the vast majority of people who undergo FGC are not women; they're children, right? They're not people who have made a choice to undergo FGC. They're people whose families have made a choice for them to undergo FGC for a lot of different reasons, right? So it's not the same conversation about agency because the people who suffer from that are minors. So it's a different discussion. But I think when you talk about being uncomfortable, that's why this has been such a fraught debate for feminists. A lot of people are really uncomfortable. There's like so much emotion about it, I think, because we have these long-standing ideas about what does it mean for a woman to give sexual services for payment, and a sense of that being an objectification. And a lot of people are really uncomfortable about that. And I get that, even though that's not how I situate myself, right? And I often just say to people, we have to be able to, in a way, kind of take our emotions out of it, because our emotions have been driving policy decisions, have been driving decisions around legal frameworks, where a lot of the reasons for criminalization have been about the need to save, the need to rescue, the need to protect. That's the reason that's given. We're uncomfortable with this and we need to protect it, protect these people. But that is actually the exact thing that has led to these deep human rights abuses, right? So there has to be, it has to be based on the evidence and not based on kind of emotion, the evidence of harm. And that's why I said it's, to me, it's a really wonderful time to be working on this, where we're seeing the mainstreaming of sex workers' rights as human rights, because groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they've been doing that hard work, and they've gotten a lot of pushback from anti-prostitution feminists. You know, when Amnesty was coming up with its policy about decriminalization, they caught a lot of hell from that, from Hollywood actresses, anti-prostitution feminists who are really uncomfortable with this. But Amnesty said, we have a human rights framework. You're talking about the global framework, the human rights framework, and we have to look at the evidence, right, of researchers like me and many others, and all of the work that sex workers themselves have been doing, because we have to acknowledge the intellectual labor of sex workers, and then doing their own research. Just time and time again, the evidence shows these laws and policies that we've constructed to protect women because we're uncomfortable with the commercialization of sex has led to deep harm against them, right? And so we have to step back and we have to center not our uncomfortability and our emotions, but we have to center the lived experiences of those people and listen to those people and follow the evidence and think about what are the legal and policy frameworks that we can put together to ensure that people who are making decisions that we might be uncomfortable with can have more power over those situations and more safety over those situations. So that's the best I can do with people who I think feel kind of deeply uncomfortable about it and are just starting to think about this issue. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to thank Professor Mgbako for coming and presenting at this Palaver, our final Palaver for spring 2018. And for the students who are here, I wanted to remind you, of course, you know, registration is opening up, and to look at our department, we have several new courses we're going to be offering. including some that deal with gender, as well as continental and regional organizations, development, Black women in popular culture. So we have several courses, and so I definitely would encourage students to check out the African Studies offerings for fall 2018, and to follow us online on Facebook specifically, where we list all of our events, opportunities like the Flash Fellowship, which the application season is in the fall. And so to pay attention to that if you're taking an African language. And thank you for coming out.
Thank you.